In relation to the first question, are Australian youth turning away from organised religion? We broadly understand that Australia is becoming a more secular country and that young people are at the forefront of this turn away from organised religion. But on the other hand, people see churches like Hillsong in Sydney, which are packed out full of young people, and they're wondering perhaps is there a revival amongst certain kinds of churches with particular young people in Australia? And we'll explore that question. The second part of today's talk is, are Australian youth spiritual? It's often thought that whilst young Australians perhaps are turning away from organised religion, they're interested in alternative forms of spirituality and different ways of being spiritual. And we're going to explore that topic as well. The first thing that I want to talk about is secularisation of Australia. This broadly refers to the fact that Australia is becoming an increasingly secular country. This table is from my new book, and it shows changes in religious affiliation in Australia from 1901 through to the last census in 2011. If you look across each row, it shows religious affiliation with different Christian denominations and other religions. So look at 1901, and if you read across, you see in 1901 40% of the population identified as Anglican, and going across that row you can see 96% of the population in 1901 said that they affiliated with a Christian church. If you look all the way down that column there where it says total Christian, you get to the bottom and you see in the last census in 2011 that 62% of the Australian population identified with a Christian denomination. And if you look at the column just a little bit to the other side, no religion, you can see that it's grown from 0% in 1901 to 22% in 2011. This is showing a really clear pattern. Australia was once a nation of people who identified themselves as Christian, and this has dropped dramatically in the course of 100 years. On the other side, the proportion of the population that identifies as having no religion has increased profoundly since 1901. And we call this process secularisation. What's caused it? Why do people identify less with Christian churches than ever before? Most people see the downturn and the turn away from churches as beginning in the 1960s in Australia. This was a time of profound cultural and social change. It was the birth of the peace movement, the hippie movement, and there were a whole lot of young people, baby boomers, becoming teenagers. And they were particularly interested in exploring alternative ways of being, and part of that involved turning away from organised religion. Then, as they became older and started to have kids, which is today's generation of young people, they just simply didn't socialise them into religious traditions like people had in the past. And so we understand this process of secularisation in Australia is kind of beginning in the 1960s. And we can see that there's been a downturn. So say in 1980, about a quarter of the population went to church every week, and that's now dropped to below 10%. So it's a profound change. And young people are at the forefront of this change. Young people are much more likely to not identify with a religion, and much more likely than older people to not attend church. So what about churches like Hillsong? It's certainly true that they're growing and that their congregations are full of young people, but their growth doesn't outweigh the broader decline in Christianity amongst teens and young adults. And many who are drawn to the Pentecostal movement are young people coming from other Christian traditions, mainline traditions, where they're not necessarily happy with the style of worship that they experience in their home denominations. In order to unpack what religion's like amongst young people in Australia, I want to draw attention to some research that I did with some colleagues from the Australian Catholic University. This was a study we conducted called The Spirit of Generation Y, and it was a major study of youth religion and spirituality in Australia. We surveyed more than 1,200 young people to understand what they thought, felt and believed about religion and spirituality. And we also conducted more than 100 face-to-face interviews. And this next part of the talk, I'm going to draw on this research in order to explain particular patterns and trajectories of religion in Australia. Well, in order to address the question, are young people turning away from organised religion? The broad answer, based on our research amongst Generation Y, is the answer is yes. We discovered that just over half of Generation Y said they believed in God. 17% said they did not believe, and 32% were unsure. So just a tiny minority of young people believe in God. We also discovered that only about 9% of teens and young adults might be classified as strong Christians. That is, that they pray weekly or more often and attend services of worship weekly more often. So basically this is showing that there's a very small proportion of teens and young adults who are actively pursuing the Christian faith. Another interesting thing that we discovered is that alternatives are not that popular either. We found that only about 14% of teens and young adults in Australia could be classified as strongly secular, that is, genuine atheists, kind of in the Richard Dawkins mould, actively and aggressively rejecting religion. We're also surprised to discover that only about 4% of teens and young adults are seriously committed to alternative spiritual paths. So a tiny proportion are interested in alternative religions. We were surprised about that figure. We'd expected it to be a little more, and I'll address that in just a minute. Our main finding is that young people are not necessarily rejecting religion out of hand. They're simply indifferent to it. It's not part of the daily makeup of their lives. And this is not surprising. They're a generation who have been raised by people who turned away from organised religion, and so they're really what their parents made them. Next, I want to address the question of alternative spiritualities and alternative spiritual beliefs. As I said earlier, there's a perception that perhaps whilst young people aren't necessarily interested in organised religion, they might be interested in spiritual alternatives. And in our survey, we questioned young people about this, and we were really surprised to discover a high proportion of young people are interested in what might be classified alternative beliefs and practices. Have a look at this table here. And if you look down the column that says yes, you can see the proportion of teens and young adults that believe in reincarnation, which was 31%. 26% believe that you can communicate with the dead. 25% believe in astrology. And 21% believe in psychics and fortune tellers. So this seems quite a reasonable proportion of young people who are believing in these things. I don't think we should necessarily think that perhaps these beliefs are on the rise. In fact, the idea that you can communicate with the dead has been incredibly popular in Western society and culture for more than 150 years. Around at the turn of the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a great interest in communicating with the dead. So young people perhaps are no different from people in the past. But what's interesting is that people are holding these kinds of beliefs without necessarily also subscribing to some kind of traditional Christian notions of belief and practice. In a sense, people are just kind of holding these beliefs without putting them into practice, following the teachings and traditions of a religious community. The best example I can demonstrate of this big shift is in afterlife belief, and it's something I've been particularly interested in exploring in my recent research. When I saw that figure that 31% of young people believed in reincarnation, I was staggered because I thought that represents a major shift in the ways that teens and young adults in Australia think. In the past, you'd think that young people, if they believed in the afterlife, would believe in traditional Christian notions that when we die, we go to heaven and perhaps experience communion with God. And doing a bit more analysis, I was stunned to discover that more young people believe in reincarnation than traditional ideas about heaven. So I think this represents a major shift. But one of the interesting things about this kind of belief is that people are doing this exploration outside the bounds and guidance of organised religion, without a community of believers with whom they share ideas. And so what happens is that young people tend to kind of formulate their own ideas about religion and spirituality. We call this religious individualism. Here's a quote from the book The Spirit of Generation Y. In matters of religion, truth means what it means for me. What is true for someone else may be quite different and has its own perfect right to exist independently without being constrained by any standard external to the individual. What I've got here is a quote from a young woman I interviewed called Catherine. She was a student, and when I interviewed her about her afterlife belief, she told me that she believed in both reincarnation and heaven. And I think this is a classic kind of example of someone formulating their own ideas and opinions about organised religion. She said, I think I'm definitely in the middle. Either is possible, that is reincarnation or heaven. And maybe even you go to heaven first and then get reincarnated. And I said to her, so spending some time in heaven and then coming back to earth? And she said, yes. Once you're suitably satisfied with paradise, you're ready to return to the human realm again, and yeah, something like that. And I think that represents this classic idea that young people are formulating their spirituality outside the bounds of organised religion without a faith community to guide them. So in answer to the two questions that I've posed today, for the most part, young people are turning away from organised religion, and there is a move towards secularisation in Australian society, and that young people are at the forefront of that. But that doesn't mean they're turning away from religion completely. It's just not part of their lives. It's not something that they think about on a daily basis. Secondly, to what extent are young people spiritual? Well, I think there's a broad interest in spiritual matters, but I wouldn't say it's a passionate engagement because there's no kind of structure or pathway in which to explore these things. If you believe in reincarnation, where do you get your ideas from? Not from a traditional religion, you just make it up yourself. And perhaps it doesn't have that much currency in their everyday lives. So, are young people religious in Australia? Not particularly. Are they spiritual? Not in any deep and meaningful way. And I think that's the trajectory of young people, religion and spirituality in Australia.